April 26, 1986, 1:23 a.m. A button is pressed. It was supposed to shut the reactor down. Instead, it did the opposite. It triggered the explosion. 2 blasts. The roof of Reactor 4 gone. Radioactive fire burning into the open sky. And here is the thing most people get wrong. They call it an accident. They blame the operators. They blame the Soviet Union. But those are the wrong answers. Because what happened that night wasn't a mistake. It was an algorithm, running exactly as designed. To understand Chernobyl, you need to understand what the Soviet nuclear program was. It wasn't just energy. It was proof. Proof that the Soviet system worked. Proof that Soviet engineering was world-class. Proof that the USSR was a superpower in every sense. By the late 1970s, the Soviets had their own reactor design, the RBMK, a Soviet invention. Powerful, efficient, a point of national pride. And it worked. Dozens of reactors online. Electricity flowing to millions of homes. On paper, a success. Because the RBMK had a flaw, a serious one. At low power, the reactor became unstable. The physics of the design created a feedback loop. The more things went wrong, the faster they got worse. Engineers call it a positive void coefficient. In plain language, the reactor was most dangerous exactly when you needed it to be safe. This flaw was not unknown. It had been identified, it had been documented, it had been filed, and then nothing happened, because in this system, bad news didn't disappear. It got buried. And buried information doesn't explode immediately. It waits. It waits while the reactor keeps running. It waits while the manuals stay incomplete. It waits while the operators train on the wrong assumptions. It waits until the exact moment you can least afford it. Three people, 3 roles inside the same machine. Watch how the system processes each of them. Thread 1, the engineer who saw it first. 1975, 11 years before Chernobyl. A reactor at the Leningrad nuclear power plant experiences a partial meltdown. The cause? The positive void coefficient. The exact same flaw. Engineers investigate. They write a report. The report is clear. The RBMK design has a serious instability problem. It must be fixed. The report is submitted to the ministry. The ministry reviews it, and then the report is classified, not destroyed, not rejected, just filed, made invisible. No redesign, no modification, no warning to other plant operators. The engineers who wrote it push carefully, quietly, for follow-through. They are told the matter is being reviewed. It is never reviewed. 11 years pass. The flaw stays in every RBMK reactor ever built. This is how the algorithm handles inconvenient data. It doesn't delete it. It buries it. Thread 2, the manager under the quota, Viktor Bryukhanov, director of the Chernobyl plant, a capable administrator, a product of the Soviet industrial system. His job, in practical terms, was simple. Keep the numbers green. Every hour a reactor is offline is an hour it isn't producing electricity. Every safety test that requires a power reduction cuts into the daily quota. There was a safety test scheduled for Reactor 4. It had already been postponed 4 times, each postponement for legitimate reasons. But each postponement also meant the next attempt would be more rushed, less prepared. By April 1986, the test was finally running. But it was running behind schedule. The day shift, the crew that had been briefed, had gone home. The night shift was taking over. They had not been fully briefed. Nobody had broken a rule to make this happen. The rules simply didn't prevent it. Thread 3. The operator at the controls, Leonid Toptunov, 26 years old, senior reactor control engineer, on duty, night shift, April 25th. He was experienced enough to sit at those controls. He was not experienced enough to know everything that was about to go wrong. When the test was authorized to begin, the reactor's power had drifted dangerously low, far below the required parameters. The safe call: wait, let the reactor stabilize, then proceed. Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer overseeing the test, gave a different order: proceed now. History usually stops here and blames Dyatlov. And Dyatlov does bear real responsibility. But here is the deeper question. Why did Dyatlov believe he could push forward? Because the system had trained him to. The RBMK operating manual did not warn operators about the instability at low power. That information was in the 1975 report, the classified one. Dyatlov had never seen it. He wasn't ignoring a known warning. He was acting on a manual the system had deliberately kept incomplete. At 1:23 a.m., Toptunov pressed the emergency shutdown button. The control rods dropped, but there was one more flaw. One nobody had told the operators about. The tip of each control rod was made of graphite, a material that increases reactivity before the neutron-absorbing section engages. For 4 seconds, the shutdown command made the reactor more powerful. The rest happened in less than 3 seconds. Two explosions, the roof gone, burning graphite scattered across the site. The operators looked at their instruments. The readings made no sense, because the instruments had a maximum reading, and the reactor had exceeded it. When your instruments can't measure the disaster, it means the disaster is already bigger than your system. And at that point, the system isn't measuring reality anymore. It's measuring what it expects to see. And when that happens, reality stops being visible. The system had already lost. It just couldn't see it. Three people, same system. Watch what it does to each of them. Anatoly Dyatlov, the man history blamed. Authoritarian, coercive, difficult. Operators were afraid to contradict him. These things are true. But here is what is also true. Dyatlov was the output of 30 years inside this system. A system that promoted confidence, penalized doubt, classified the reports he needed to do his job safely. He pushed his operators that night, not because he was reckless, but because the algorithm had never shown him what recklessness looked like. Viktor Bryukhanov, the man who sent the false reports. After the explosion, Bryukhanov reported to Moscow. Radiation levels to 3.6 Röntgen per hour. Elevated, manageable, under control. The actual levels in some areas, over 15,000 Röntgen per hour. Why the gap? The high-range dosimeters were locked in a safe. The low-range ones simply maxed out, hit their ceiling, displayed 3.6. That was the number that went into the report. Not a lie, exactly. A system that had never seriously rehearsed. the possibility of a worst-case scenario, because officially, worst-case scenarios didn't happen. Valery Legasov, the scientist who eventually told the truth, dispatched to Chernobyl as lead investigator. Within hours, he understood the scale, a catastrophe of extraordinary magnitude. He also understood something else. Saying so, immediately, loudly, publicly, was not something his system was built to do. For 2 years, he navigated this tension. Enough information to manage the crisis. Enough restraint to protect the program. On the second anniversary of the explosion, April 26, 1988, Legasov recorded a series of audio tapes, the full truth, the design flaws, the classified reports, the culture of concealment. Then he ended his life. The tapes were released the next day. Within weeks, the Soviet nuclear industry was forced to implement the modifications that had been recommended and ignored. Since 1975, it took one man's final act to do what a single report could have done 11 years earlier. Now here is the moment most history books skip. Not the explosion, a meeting, 1983, 3 years before Chernobyl. A group of Soviet nuclear physicists completes an internal study. Their findings are unambiguous. The RBMK positive void coefficient, serious risk at low power, the graphite-tipped control rods, dangerous transient upon emergency shutdown, both problems, both fixable, both documented. The study is presented to the ministry. The ministry reviews it, and then nothing, not a rejection, not a formal decision to delay, just silence. The report is filed. The reactors keep running. The operators, who will one day stand at those controls, are never told. This is the moment. Not because of what was decided, but because of what wasn't. The system's most powerful capability is not suppression. It's not censorship. It's something quieter. The ability to let critical information simply disappear. No villain, no conspiracy, no smoking gun, just an organization that had learned over decades to route bad news away from the people who needed it. That is the algorithm, and it ran without anyone turning it on. Two forks. Two moments where the algorithm could have been interrupted. Both would have prevented April 26th. Fork 1, 1975. The Leningrad report goes public. After the partial meltdown, there is a window, a narrow one, 1975 to 1977, where the findings could plausibly have been escalated, made mandatory, distributed, acted on. Imagine one person, senior enough to force the issue, who walks into a ministry meeting and says, out loud, in writing, our reactors have a serious flaw. We need to fix them. What changes? First, the RBMK operating manual gets an explicit prohibition. No operating below a minimum power threshold, without additional safeguards. This single change stops the April 25th test before it ever reaches the dangerous phase. Second, the graphite-tipped control rod problem gets flagged for redesign. Soviet engineers could solve this. Timeline, 5 to 8 years. That puts the fix in place around 1982, 4 years before Chernobyl. Third, and most important, a precedent is set. When a major flaw in a flagship Soviet technology is officially acknowledged and officially corrected, the algorithm changes. We can say when things are wrong. Once that precedent exists, every future safety conversation become slightly less dangerous, slightly less career-ending, slightly more honest. Chernobyl doesn't happen, not because anyone became a hero, but because information was allowed to do what information is supposed to do: reach the people who needed it. Fork 2, 1979. Anonymous safety reporting. The same year as 3 Mile Island, the American nuclear incident. That changed Western safety culture. After 3 Mile Island, several programs implemented anonymous safety reporting systems. Workers could flag concerns without attaching their name, without risking their career. A suggestion box with legal protection. That's simple. Now imagine the Soviet nuclear industry adopts something similar, not because of ideology, not because of politics, just as an operational tool. The operators on the night of April 25th feel the pressure to proceed, that they know something is wrong. They don't have a mechanism to escalate that feeling without directly confronting Dyatlov, which, given his personality, none of them will do. But with anonymous reporting, one note: we were pressured to run the test below safe parameters. That note creates a paper trail. Paper trails create accountability. Accountability creates the possibility that someone, somewhere in the system, stops what is happening. Before 1:23 a.m., Chernobyl doesn't happen. Again, not through heroism, through administration. The algorithm is not inevitable. It just runs until you redesign it. Here is the part most people don't know. The explosion didn't just release radiation. It released the Soviet Union's most dangerous secret, that the system could fail, catastrophically, publicly. On live international news, Mikhail Gorbachev later said, Chernobyl was the real cause of the Soviet collapse. Not the economy, not the arms race, not political reform. Chernobyl. Because it proved, in a way that could not be censored, that the official story and the real story were two completely different things. Within 3 years, the Berlin Wall fell. Within 5 years, the USSR ceased to exist. So what do we actually learn? The easy lesson is, don't cut corners on safety. That lesson is useless. Because nobody at Chernobyl thought they were cutting corners. They thought they were operating normally. The real lesson is this: every system has a failure mode. The question is not whether your system has flaws. Every system has flaws. The question is, can your system hear about them? When organizations optimize for good news, bad news stops traveling. When managers are rewarded for hitting targets, problems stop being reported. When engineers file safety reports that disappear into silence, they stop filing safety reports. And the gap grows between the official story and the real story, between what the instruments show and what is actually happening, until the gap is so wide that no single person even knows the full truth anymore. That's not a Soviet problem. That's not a 1986 problem. That is what happens when the feedback loops inside a system stop working. It happens in nuclear plants, in banks, in hospitals, in governments, in any organization with enough layers, between the people who see the problem and the people with the power to fix it. The algorithm runs everywhere. Valery Legasov's tapes were released the day after his death. Within weeks, The modifications that had been recommended since 1975 were finally implemented. The RBMK reactors are still running today. In Russia, modified, but running. And somewhere right now, in some organization, in some industry, a report is being filed. A concern is being raised. A flaw is being documented, and the system is deciding what to do with it. So here's the only question that matters. Not, could Chernobyl happen again? But, is it already happening? Somewhere you can't see, in a system built to make sure. You never find out. Chernobyl was not a mistake. It was an algorithm, and it ran exactly as designed. The only question is, are you inside one right now, or are you part of the reason it keeps running? Thanks for watching. This was Historithm. See you in the next video.